Uh, I've actually lost track of some of the recordings that I've made recently, so I'm not sure if I'm going to repeat some content. I can't remember if I uploaded a recording that talked about Jordan Peterson and Stephen Fry's discussion, although what I want to talk about now is only thematically related to that. I kind of made a preemptive recording about that, and now since I'm watching it, I don't think I've made a recording about it, but anyway, that's not that important. So the title of this video is going to be something like the importance or the value of insulting people's intelligence, or at least slurs that used to be, at least when I was growing up, and in the 90s, I think the culture was fundamentally different, where essentially it was on the table that you could insult someone's intelligence, that you could call them stupid, you could use the slur retarded. And I think that uh, how culture has shifted, that you cannot insult someone's intelligence or go after them, is incredibly impoverishing to the quality of discourse. Obviously, calling someone stupid is an ad hominem attack, and you get, I've always thought that those kinds of retorts are basically are fatuous and useless, and but essentially bringing. Let me just, let's say, give a rundown as to what insulting someone's intelligence brings to the table. Now, there is a slight built-in conflation in terms of insulting someone's intelligence, that either you're insulting the substance of their argument or you're insulting their character as an individual. That either they are making a kind of a reckless argument, perhaps, or an ungrounded, that they have a faulty premise. But essentially, what insulting someone's intelligence does is that it brings the grounding of the conflagration. It brings the clash of both people's positions. At least thematically, I believe it brings it onto the table so that it can at least be directly contended with or addressed. So let's say that each person's grounds in their reasoning is being signaled, is being gestured to, is being pointed at least uh, uh, indirectly. So I think that insulting someone's intelligence brings into the matters in issue a kind of meta discussion about the other person's world view, or one of their premises in their worldview, or how they are grounding a particular argument, or and then the conflation here is that gets conflated with attacking somebody else's good faith or their bona fides. Are they being genuine and honest in making a particular case, or having a particular position on a particular matter? So I think it's also implicitly an indictment on that ground as well, which is in some sense, I think, a needed element which has been completely lost in intellectual discourse, or at least just discourse in general, at least in the realm of complicated matters like politics and things like that, is calling into question someone's authenticity in holding a position. And some people, let's say, authentically hold positions, but because their character of their intellectualism or of their worldview, or in terms of their moral grounding in their own framework, is basically sort of nihilistic. And so, when you're dealing with people that have such, let's say, relativistic, flimsy positions, that they're not just saying things because it's a devil's advocate sort of point that they don't actually stand behind, but they believe that essentially, if you can leverage a volley of sort of hard skepticism and somebody else can't defeat the hard skepticism, then essentially anything goes, or it might as well be anything goes, because you have to have a kind of hard rationalist framework that enables you to have any kind of moral computing or something like that. And people that have that kind of standard are essentially are playing a sort of a game out of morality and playing a game out of discourse itself. Um, that they get to leverage the obstacles, and if they can't be knocked down, then sort of wherever the wind blows or something like that, then then no one has recourse to hold a position or something like that, and that is a fundamentally relativistic nihilism or something like that. It's just it's a kind of it's an intellectual game that people play. And I do think that you get to the point of uncovering that kind of disingenuousness, uh, um, which is it's a particular brand of disingenuousness. I mean, I don't obviously people I think genuinely hold that kind of mentality. It's a rather reactive mentality. It's a rather sort of destructive and malevolent. Sort of it has a lot of um, complacency and sort of self-invested uh, sort of entitlement, that if you can just come up with some kind of rational accusation, that's good enough. That's a good enough excuse not to have to pursue any kind of sort of value maximization, or holding to having any kind of values or principles, or sort of not endorsing any positive ascriptions of value in one's mentality, because you can just come up with really good excuses and accusations to throw around, and then you can kind of get by. Now, the reason why I say that, so you can just see, this is some of the things, this was the kind of moral relativism that I think was seeping through in the Jordan Peterson Stephen Fry exchange, which which sadly I do think that although Stephen Fry does say some things that I commend, in terms of that before he goes to sleep he thinks about how to be a better person, kind of thing, and I think that is certainly a laudable orientation. That is certainly how one um, the contemplative life that is needed, the introspective soul, is I think required, but how quickly he kind of relies on this weird kind of moral relativism, where essentially he doesn't want to get involved in the culture wars, and he'll sort of the kind of whatever whatever sort of happens, he'll see afterwards, kind of where the chips lie, and um, that kind of reticence, I think, is a kind of moral cowardice. Although, I mean, I guess he kind of signaled, sort of ideas which he endorses, which he said would have to be a whole different discussion, essentially. But sort of pointing to the postmodernists and the need for deconstructing language and things like that. Now, again, I've I would dispel. I mean, so he just gestured to that. He didn't go into the specific argument of that, but I think that he was basically fobbing Jordan Peterson off. I mean, look, I mean, I have to sort of extrapolate into the discussion that they didn't have, but I think that everything that Stephen Fry pointed to falls into the category of how I've just described. That you just come up with very interesting, sophisticated deconstructions, which are basically accusations. They're basically skeptical obstacles, and if somebody else isn't capable of disarming them, then it fosters the right amount of, let's say, doubt and perturbation, that you can just kind of continue in your malaise and sort of and your moral nihilism. And so I do think that it's a defensive moral nihilism. Um, anyway, so that's perhaps an unfair extension to make, but um, I mean, I also think that the empiricalism that Stephen Fry describes is also fundamentally kind of nihilistic. I mean, it doesn't have a moral. Um, I mean, in some sense, it's a completely utilitarian worldview, because you have to define happiness and good essentially as some kind of material outcome, or some kind of, which side cause the least amount of harm or something like that. You have to maximize some kind of utilitarian thing, and I do think I mean, so I mean, yeah, so. Uh, I have the sort of the humor and the Locke stuff is stuff that I think the only way that you have to have an epistemological pragmatism, which I ground in epistemic agency, which means that individuals actually have to endorse their values, and they're true because of your agency endorsing them. And if you don't do that, there is no alternative. You can't just sort of count up some kind of empirical. The, the world does not have a codex like that. Uh, um, so that's a very wordy way of basically saying um, trying to work out values in some kind of historical reductive aggregation of outcomes or something like that. I think that that can be a valuable way of fishing for substantive quandaries to plumb the depths of and to ponder, but that cannot be the central moral computation. Essentially, it's fundamentally vacuous, and so to the extent to which Stephen Fry leans on that as being his primary tenet of founding a moral worldview or something like that. I mean, I do think his nihilism was essentially peeking through, although there's some bits of rationality and rationale. He has said some positive things in the culture war. He has made some interesting arguments, but essentially, sadly, he's not that great an ally, I would say, because someone who is fundamentally, um, it pains me to say, but someone who is in fact an nihilistic on the level of values, um, who is a kind of social relativist on the level of values, you're not going to get any real aid. And I think that was what Jordan Peterson and Stephen Fry was sort of ran aground, although which looked like Stephen Fry fobbing off Jordan Peterson. And anyway, and that's my diagnosis of it, although it's a bit of a, let's say, a hypothetical extrapolation of what was not said as much as what was said. Um, anyway, let me get back to the point of this main subject matter. I would say that the culture itself, the diseased culture that we have at the moment, which I would say is largely infected with what I would characterize as a kind of identitarian imperialism. I, which is more obviously perhaps seen in the left's so-called left's tolerance of a kind of racialist imperialism as a kind of cultural uh, uh, template through which all I mean, you can see this in myriad places. In the particular strikes that YouTube have pinned on Stephen Crowder. Like, so one of the strikes that he got was because he made a comment that one of the policemen that I think shot and killed a woman who was going to who was about to stab somebody else, and therefore the actions of the policeman actually saved uh, potentially life and limb of the person that was going to get stabbed, um, and and he uh, said that the policeman involved did the right thing. Um, and and this was seen as some kind of reveling in the death of someone, or that was one of the interpretations of the strike. But essentially that it was, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was something like it was offensive essentially, and the obvious reason why this was flagged as being offensive was essentially on the basis of protecting racialist pride or something like that, or advancing the general narrative of people's sort of narcissistic injury around their racial imperialism, and how all racial imperialism needs to sort of have an equal factionalized, sort of balkanization, carving up culture into power factions, and sort of playing a game of power and politics on the level of that kind of group tribal sort of allegiance. Um, anyway, my point is that and it's also funny that this is always done in the name of protecting people from having hurt feelings. That this is always done in the name of that this is going to upset people. So that's why you get a strike, is because you're making content that is upsetting to people's group narcissism, essentially. And you can also, I've called this, sort of this identity imperialism, a kind of it's a 200-year, it's older than that even, but it's a very old sort of software, societal cultural software that allows you to sort of operate a kind of ordered society that at least isn't based on, let's say, market relations. So essentially it is an alternative to capitalism. It's kind of like a feudal um, uh, orientation, except that instead of king and country, you have essentially the spirit of the identity, as the kind of as the collective good and the organizing principle, and which has a kind of mythology around it, and its own narrative, and so everything is justified in having this kind of totemic, unitary, sort of ideological worldview, which essentially, just at the expense of sort of dissolving the individual, the dignity of the individual, the moral consideration of the individual is dissolved, and all the things that an individual might possess has to come from the collective moral consideration of the group entity that is the source of all value. So the what is you are society is under the imperium of the identitarian source of all meaning and value, and so it solves the kind of the moral relativism by making the worldview, instead of something that you endorse by your own value and your own ascription, it makes it into a kind of a lived out mythology, which is, basically I've called it fascistic culture, fascistic politics, and sort of it's come under now in this form. It's come under, identity politics. It's called, but I mean, it's basically a neo form, or it's a new form of imperialism based on a kind of racial groupthink, and race-based morality, and racial essentialism, and all those other sort of dirty, nasty things. Anyway, now I would say that this stuff doesn't just appear out of nowhere. You had to. I mean, obviously, some people did subscribe to this kind of liberation through racial imperialism. This has existed within our society. Usually, it's been suppressed. People with identitarian, imperialist, sort of narratives and mythologies and worldviews. We would call these people kooks, or they would have, that they had rotten ideas, and then they had poisonous, toxic, so they were basically sort of even half, surreal in their sort of delusions of you know of the sort of caricaturized, you know, sort of mentality and reality. You know, these are people that are like living in a kind of medieval feudalistic, you know, kind of prison of the mind. um, but it's, you know, it's a safe, and you know, it makes the world simple, and all those sorts of things. You know, it's a low IQ sort of mob mentality. um, Now, this might always exist in some small elements, in some, you know, dribs and drabs of society, but for it to actually make inroads into being installed into a culture, into a society, you have to create a vacuum. You have to hollow out that society. And I believe that the common values that were hollowed out came through a particular vector of, I mean, I'm going to just focus on it thematically in terms of how to reverse this trend. It came through the political correctness of not being able to insult someone's intelligence. When you couldn't call people stupid anymore, when it couldn't be used as a valid slur, when you couldn't call people retarded, we lost something. We lost an engine towards deriving and negotiating towards common values and a common reasoning. Because you see, if you can't call people stupid and therefore, in some sense, indict them for having, let's say, a wishy washy, uh, um, ungrounded position, or fundamentally flawed worldview, or a faulty premise, or you know, saying that, well, your premises are just constituted in a way that is just not taking, is just so fundamentally cherry picked, or you know, all these things are somewhat implicit in perhaps calling someone stupid, or just saying that they, you know, they're making fallacious arguments, or they're just not very careful or serious about, you know, being, you know, authentically actually engaging, or bringing, you know, a semi-serious, you know, semblance of sentiments and you know, sort of intellectual positions that you're actually trying to cohere with, you know, and integrating into a shared reality. Um, you know, so you can sort of point to people that, no, you're not actually trying to integrate your worldview in a way that makes sense, that actually can be understood. It's just, you know, sort of a cozy, sentimental sort of hobby horse of yours to feel superior or something like that. And now, you know, we've given people that have those kinds of bad faith sentiments, we've given them the ammunition of saying, no one can call you stupid, no one can call you retarded, and actually getting into matters of, let's say, genuine intellectual exchange. Instead, you can just rest on your laurels and just say that you can just call, both sides can just call each other evil, because there's now no longer a bridge of actually hashing out uh, 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 the underlying themes of how people ground their reasoning and ground their the authenticity of their intellectual position, you know, and actually defending that position with critical thinking and reasoning, has all been thrown out the window, because we can't talk about, let's say, the meta issues of, let's say, having an authentic position, or having a position that is properly integrated, and you know, so we've sort of allowed people to entrench themselves in kind of poisonous relativism. Um, and there's no bridge of, let's say, moving towards a common sense reasoning, and you know, sort of getting people with beliefs and opinions that actually are responsive and responsible in terms of being integrated, or at least somewhat fleshed out, or even you know, capable of being broken down and redigested and recapitulated. You know, and that does require at some level to say, you know, actually, well, you're missing, you know, how can you not have this fundamental axiomatic value or principle, or how can you construct a position that essentially is trying to speak uh, uh, on this kind of issue, and it's sort of it it's strangely being conflated with some other issue or something like that. And the biggest sort of problem is that a lot of people um, they can basically cherry pick their reality tunnel out of factoids and half truths, if you can just sort of allow yourself to indulge in allowing yourself to have some generalizations over some issues, and then not have generalizations over other issues. And the kind of that particular fashion, or at least the current matrix of fashion that we have now, which is kind of also the engine of this so-called postmodern, kind of identitarian method of deconstruction, is that essentially the buckets of people's identity categories, that those are, let's say, the loci of moral consideration and moral merit and value, that essentially, if you can work out that that you can break down people into categories of identity, and that is their kind of the substance of their meritorious delivery address. It's horrible to use a metaphor there, but that the kind of the moral essentialism of those dimensions and categories of identity. Um, you know, yeah, I mean, it is just strange because it's such a dehumanizing. It's a weird kind of paradox, because they're like, well, if you don't treat me like a category and then apportion an equal size of your attention and devotion and sort of if you don't deliver to me an outcome that is of some uh, equal parity to every other category, um, then I'm accusing you of dehumanizing me, as I force you to essentially overcome this hypothetical abstraction, an obstacle that I am essentially voicing and projecting against you. And so you force other people to be incepted into essentially uh, a kind of a reactive mentality. It's like you have to indulge in other people's sort of reactive uh, um, narrative of sort of defiance and rectification and restitution on behalf of these categories. So the categories really become the the center uh, of all values in some sense. And so you do have essentially a way of translating, um, let's say, an abstract reduction and reading of reality into values, which is all done through this negative translation of essentially, well, you're not treating this the same as something else, so you must treat everything the same, according to whatever the arbitrary breakdown is, because you can always make contradictory breakdowns and contradictory reductions, because abstractions have no, uh, you know, um, have no quantifiable limit on how they can be uh, repartitioned over the matrix that you're projecting onto reality. So you have this sort of this never-ending engine of vulnerable narcissism and narcissistic injury. And one of the convenient ways to defend yourself against all of this bullshit essentially is to just create an opposing imperialism where you say, no, 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 well, that's because these identitarian factions or facets deserve to have X, Y, and Z. Rather than essentially just saying, um, instead of equating identitarian facets with abstractions of moral justification and moral bestowed rewards and benefits sort of being distributed within a system, you actually ground it in a bootstrapped agent of individuals. And then you can actually see what real empowerment, the actual materials with which you have to work, with which humanity and individuals actually, have at hand, in terms of what they actually are doing as agents, and the kind of the translation of agency into a kind of an identitarian avatar, and anyway, so I mean, it's obviously it's very dark and self-incepted and delusional, but anyway, like, I mean, I've really yeah, so but yeah, so I mean, at this point, you can't directly, I guess, the cultural shift that I'm trying to proselytize about in terms of bringing back calling people stupid and calling people retarded, in some sense, doesn't solve the complexity of the kind of the toxic self-righteousness and sort of self-incepted insanity of the so-called left. It can't, when you're dealing with identitarians, you are dealing with the same sorts of people that made the Ku Klux Klan. You're dealing with the same kinds you're dealing with the same types of personalities that swelled the Nazi rallies. These are the same types of mentalities, and they've already seized the instruments of, let's say, the garb of moral authority. They've already somehow taught a whole generation this new moral template of where, sort of moral consideration comes from and all that stuff. So, uh, I guess I don't know how to sort of reverse that with what I'm saying now, but basically, I do think that from a pedagogical point of view, from uh, you know, from how children relate to one another, and how arguments happen, and how um, I, I I think that generally the solution, that how culture is structured, we need to sort of try to normalize and bring back essentially um, using insults of intelligence, because it's the only way to bring up issues of authenticity and substance, in terms of dealing with interlocutors or dealing with people that we have disagreements with. If that can't be on the table, then if bringing people's intelligence into question cannot be part of let's say, the format of an exchange, um, I think that there is no tool to to sort of troubleshoot other people's ungrounded worldviews and positions. It's in some senses the, calling somebody else stupid or retarded is at the very least a way of holding up a flag of protest, saying that no, your worldview or your principles or your axioms are just so fundamentally um, inadequate or low quality that they I can't even interface with your argument, because essentially it it doesn't even have the form of an argument or something like that. It gives you the lever to actually to get onto a different meta level or something like that, either on the level of dissecting the other person's bona fides, their good faith, um, in terms of their authenticity of holding a position, but also the substance and the consistency of that position. And, it does often lead to, let's say, I mean, sadly, this sickness is so broad. So perhaps when I was growing up, I would, I mean, constantly have this style of argument with people, essentially that uh, they are just so stupid that their whole mentality is so fundamentally reactive, and so sort of entrenched into, sort of circular um, reasoning, uh, so that they could somehow get away with their sort of very flimsy thinking and sort of vacuous gainsaying, um, or fundamentally just a very lax and nihilistic, kind of um, skeptical gainsaying, which essentially is itself also very toxic to deal with, because you're dealing with someone who is essentially setting up like little mini puppet shows of counter arguments that are just kind of endlessly generated in order to dissuade you from ever being able to actually target, let's say, their vacuous character as an intellectual. Like being able to endlessly generate skeptical um, accusations or permutations of possible doubts, um, while making it impossible to outline thematically and describe that the engine of constructing such red herrings is essentially someone who's almost fundamentally toying with discourse, um, or at least is treating the bounds of discourse as being, sort of fundamentally of hypothetical value, um, like as a rhetorical exercise of how to of how you can continue to sort of fob off an interlocutor. Um, yeah. So anyway, and there are lots of species of that kind. If I can just lump them together and call them sort of de facto disingenuousness. There's a lot of different species of disingenuous sophists. And uh, you know. It can be. I mean, sometimes you can have certain agreements and disagreements where you can get down to thematically showing the incompatibility in worldviews, which I think is fine. You can agree to disagree. You don't have to have a winner and a loser of an argument, but to better define the conflagration of worldviews and themes, and perhaps showing incongruities, with particular constellations of values and principles in one's intellectual constitution, that generates such a platform or intellectual edifice is itself also valuable. If you do care about integrating and synthesizing a higher understanding. Or a better understanding of what to do and how to live, uh, um, and how to have one's eyes extended in their reasoning. Um, anyway, sorry, now I'm thinking about other things that I want to talk about, which aren't about this topic. But yeah, so let me just think if there was any formulations of this idea that I didn't mention already. Yeah, so I was just trying to give some kind of rundown that I think that essentially how intellectualism got so bad essentially was that we took calling people stupid and retarded off the table, and at the same time, at least if you could call someone stupid and evil, then or retarded and evil, there is a way in which that gets uncovered into a more that is a signal and a flag being raised that there are that you're kind of pointing to deeper themes in terms of people's grounding that need to be assessed or looked at if the discourse is going to continue. And if you take that off the table, then all you're left with is just calling the other person evil and bad. But you see, if you call them stupid and evil, then at least you can say, this is what you don't understand. There are things, your worldview is just so badly grounded that you are just blithely ignoring things that cannot be ignored, that your reasoning is so lax and haphazard or something like that, that at least if you call someone stupid and evil, there's a way in which you can see how that can promote negotiating a more thorough uh, uh, expounding of the actual points of disagreement. Whereas if you can't do that, there is no bridge to common values. If you don't have the stupid and the retarded slurs and labels, then you just are calling the other person evil and bad. And then both sides are indistinguishable from one another. Now, okay, so I mean, that's basically my thesis. And essentially the idea that, in some sense, the whole identitarian uh, racial imperialism stuff is so fundamentally antithetical to because it doesn't matter how clever or smart or intelligent you are or not, because everything is just automatically a function of these group generalizations and this moral consideration vested in these abstract entities. So you've kind of already intelligence is irrelevant because you're dealing with a mythology, you're dealing with a narrative. But in some sense, I wonder if there isn't at least a pedagogical. I'm just trying to think that if pedagogically, if what I'm saying isn't why culture has exploded in this kind of, let's say, stupidity, which has grown from in some sense, I think in part, to the removal of the normalcy of insulting people's intelligence. Because when it was no longer politically correct to insult people's intelligence, we essentially devalued reasoning in negotiating common values and uh, uh, promulgating the resolution of issues through, let's say, higher standards of reasoning and intellect. Instead, they've just kind of fallen on this kind of lowest common denominator of 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 this kind of sociological mob generalization and mentality of this kind of low I, because uh, there's lots of interesting stuff about IQ, and you can, a lot of people blame women in particular for the lower standards in a lot of institutions, that essentially under the guise of feminism, because people need to be given a kind of token position, so that they can essentially be tokens of progress in a system, and that kind of attainment of a kind of sort of the normalization of imposters into a system that then have to fight their own imposter syndrome and all that kind of stuff, that which is stuck in this paradox of this kind of identity imperialism between men and women or something like that. I think that sorry, I'm losing my point slightly. That in some sense, I mean, just from a values perspective, from a cultural perspective, it might have happened through the vector of feminism, or at least this current way of feminism. But I think the thing that was essentially distorted and degraded was essentially the value of reasoning and understanding and intellect and intelligence and critical thinking. And essentially, as soon as you couldn't criticize people for being stupid, then essentially you could get away with sort of the emperor is wearing no clothes and no one says anything. And so there are all these would-be emperors that would be going around with no clothes, but the thing that sort of kept society safe from that kind of degradation was that people would actually say, you're not wearing any clothes. They would call people stupid and retarded. But since we removed that, anyway, that's my basic thesis. That was the power vacuum that then now has been colonized by this kind of low IQ mob mentality, where everyone can be part of this kind of sophisticated politics, of this kind of identity mongering and all that kind of stuff. But it also, there's another important point here, is that, now I've just lost it. It was something about the groups and the identity. Yeah, so I mean, in some sense, sort of, we as a culture lost the value, the positive value of reasoning and let's say genuine or authentic intellectualism. And because essentially we devolved into a kind of virtue signaling around some kind of identity imperialism, the first in some sense being feminism, but essentially all that kind of feminism stuff was generally kept in check until there was enough political correctness that removed essentially the positive value of let's say you could even call it professionalism and reasonableness, sort of as a value has been directly supplanted by a kind of virtue signaling um, around supporting women and supporting the entitlement of people who are essentially sort of who have now taken over culture with this kind of low IQ mob mentality, driving towards this kind of lowest common denominator in which morality itself loses all value and meaning. Um, it's just sort of gainsaid, and you can just use generalizations. And now you. Oh yes, I was going to talk about the secondary economy of a kind of an intelligentsia and a kind of pseudo intellectual who can sort of create the cover story, sort of be like the kind of the collective white knight of this sort of political engine, and that they sort of are there to lend credibility and a kind of intellectual moral authority by sort of dressing up the the mob mentality in a kind of in a creed of sort of pseudo intellectualism. And so you have this kind of a kind of fascistic apologetics that develop from people like Destiny on YouTube, for instance, uh, and other kind of cerebral narcissists who essentially can feel eminently sort of one of these armchair revolutionaries that essentially helps. So anyway, I mean, this is not such an important point, but I just wanted to say that there is a kind of um, it's an interesting amalgamate, in terms of burgeoning of these sort of neo-imperialistic cultures, which are basically normalizing fascistic politics and a fascistic template to society, but also how it just kind of fundamentally breeds this kind of hollow mediocrity and hollowing out of intellectual um, rigor and as everything gets translated into strange, kind of intellectual gymnastics and linguistic semantic, equivalencies, which essentially ends up becoming, intellectualism gets translated into essentially a semantic game of sort of parroting and rote, sort of sounding sophisticated phrases. Um, which is, I mean, I just see it as a secondary economy that's essentially built around entrenching the vulnerable narcissism of the mob mentality. Um, I mean, we have really culturally, right before our very eyes, the whole engine of fascism and totalitarianism, which is, I must say, I can't say that I'm not unhappy that we have this example. I think that this is exactly what we need, because this is why we don't have nice things as a society, is because of these so-called revolutionaries. These are the toxic elements in our society that have never allowed us to have proper libertarian clean politics, because essentially of their indulgence, of their own corruptions, of their own solipsistic kind, their own sort of self-insulating autism, and their sort of solipsistic projections onto onto essentially being the moral arbiter of a kind of unilateral reality that doesn't have to reconcile with other people's reasoning, that they can just choose the narrative that they want to live in, and they don't have to negotiate, they don't have to persuade. It's just a kind of it's I mean, you see stories, or there's a cartoon in my head of sort of generals pushing around troops on a map or something like that, and reconciling themselves to casualties being taken and things like that. But these are people who who do this with a moral kind of um, you know, the ends justify the means, and it'll all work out, if we just subscribe to their plan, if everyone just sort of bends the knee, and gets with the program. um, and that is the exact kind of calculus of the people. Like, I mean, that's explicitly in their rationale. They are like, well, yeah, we don't believe what the mob believes, but they're going to help us cross the line. They're going to get us to the finish. It's sort of, that it's going to be more good than bad. Uh, you know, they're they're not quite intellectuals. They're uh, sort of like, I can't think of a good reproach right now, but it's kind of something like sentimental cheerleaders that are entrenched in a kind of reactive mentality and vulnerable narcissism as the source of all life, as the way to essentially convert the process of life into an abstract um, sort of deliverance machine of formal, logical, rational lines and structures, which essentially becomes only workable even within its own ideological framework if the whole world can be enslaved by its program, and by the weight of its machination. It has to parasitically attach itself to any and every sort of decision making thing, as long as it is installed as the highest value, that it will bring the promise that is somehow locked within its forms and structures, and it is the formalism that will translate access to increasing value for everyone. And so, it's a brainiac. I mean, it's Brainiac from Superman comic books. It's the thing that destroyed Krypton, because it turns the planet, it turns the Earth into a Krypton that it is completely disconnected. These people do not have their feet on the Earth. They it's parasitically beneath the weight of their machination, and the formal derivation of all value. Uh, because and that's the value of vulnerable narcissism, is that it gives you that almost objective reliability and dependability on using this strategy, on using this tactic. Um, that you can just pull another skeptical obstacle out of a hat, and say, well, you're not showing that there's equality and parity on each of these categories, therefore you are problematic, and you've got the aura of social injustice around you. And as long as you're the one leveraging the accusation, um, as long as you are the ringleader against the people who have the aura of social injustice. It's sort of it's a fundamentally fudged, sort of it just never ends. It's just, and it cannot be ordered other than essentially a tyranny that controls it. It literally is what is thematically being depicted in the Lord of the Rings, the One Ring to rule them all. that grants the power of invisibility, because that is the source of tyranny, is that you become invisible to your own structure, to your own sight, and your own infernal machinations. It's the only way to operate within the system, is that you are invisible, but everything else is subject to the projection, um, and the paradoxes, and the and the wishy-washy, fudged leveraging of generalizations, the double standards. Anyway, okay, I've pontificated enough, but I, the let me just bring in one Christian theme here. I mean, a lot of Christians, I think, don't understand the content of the doctrine of Christ quite properly. But the thing that makes Christianity special is essentially how it formulates truth, which is almost a fluid and organic sort of the spirit of truth. It's a spirit, but also, it's the same as the spirit of discerning, and all. So, understanding and knowledge and wisdom. But uh, this will sound at least alien to some Christian people, I guess. But the most important part of the doctrine is the only begotten Son of God. So the Son of God is the only begotten Son of God. That God only has one Son, essentially, the only begotten. And that is the way. So there's only one way. There's only one begotten way. There's only one spirit of truth. And, yes, it's complicated. I'm not going to get into how you access that, but then understanding and reasoning is very, very important. If there's one way, you're searching for the one way. You have to listen for the spirit of truth. It's something that you hear. These are things that orientate a worldview in which you can actually reach agreement. You can actually have something that you can have, so this is the opposite, I would say, to the kind of the nihilism and the and the social relativism and all those sorts of things, which get you into some kind of tyranny. At the end of the day, is you end up signing or consigning yourself to some kind of tyranny, whereas anyway, you have to have some kind of formula, or formulation, to at least have a single moral universe. Otherwise, I would say you make yourself into a kind of solipsist, or a kind of or a strange kind of nihilistic meat machine, or something like that. But what's quite sad is, I think, the kind of the fascist culture that I argue against, and the identity imperialists and things like that. These are people who don't even have a moral dimension. Their universe is made up of sociological constructs that you each have your own sort of kooky narrative sort of attachment to. So in some sense, it doesn't matter if other people actually believe in the same thing or not, so long as they sort of follow the script or something. And so everyone can have their own relativism around their own narrative. Whereas, sort of, anyway, I'm just trying to juxtapose that with the Christian mentality, that you can actually have one mind and be of one mind. the same condition of mind, the same quality of your understanding. That there is a single truth to be attained. That yeah, and that these things are all spiritual. They're not material. They're all in principles and values, essentially. Um, I would say, famously, the Christian values are entrenched foremost in spiritual. It's foremost the spirit. So it's foremost immaterial before the material. And without that kind of emphasis on values first, essentially, I don't think you. Anyway, I don't think you have the rigidity. I don't think there's an alternative in which you can even have meaning and sanity. Sanity itself and meaning itself has no meaning unless you make that kind of ontological commitment in your own epistemology. Um, anyway, uh, and I mean, this is famously why all the mystery schools wouldn't touch you unless you were a theist. You had to be essentially a monotheist, or they didn't want anything to do with you. Because if you're an atheist at the end of the day, that's what I would argue it basically comes down to, is that if you don't have this fundamental commitment or concern with the way, the truth, like I don't think, it's interesting. That, I mean, or some translations have the light and some translations say the life, but at least the light, even in Genesis, I would say, is the light that was created before the sun and the stars and the moon. The first thing that was made in creation was the light, and the light is the spiritual light. It's not the natural light. It's not material. It's spiritual. The light is the light of reason, and reason is God in creation. The first thing God made was the light because he was making himself in creation. And then obviously there's also, at least symbolically, the connection between light and love as well. But anyway, um, I mean, you can see how. I mean, I guess some detractors will just say, well, this is just basic Platonism, and I mean, yeah, I think that it is the, brilliant light of being, the ideal forms. Uh, I think this is all in the light of reason. Anyway, I've digressed enough, I guess, and I wanted to make a recording about something else. Let me finish this. This is an important addendum, and I'm slightly annoyed with myself because I was just listening to my own recording 10 minutes and 30 seconds in, and I remember that I go down this whole particular discourse, and because I mean the focus of this recording was not Stephen Fry and Stephen Fry's philosophical position, um, But I do have more things to say about Stephen Fry's philosophical position in terms of debunking it, or at least deconstructing it, into the actual moral constituents and mechanisms that I think undergird it. So I'm going to do that now. So this is kind of like a segue from the 10 minutes 30 seconds into my recording. So Stephen Fry even calls his sort of worldview a kind of empiricalism, or empiricism. Uh, and I think that how I would at least explain the substance and the content around these matters is that, and Stephen Fry almost beautifully lays this out himself, that there's a difference between knowledge and understanding. That you can think you understand things, you can understand models, and understanding is basically completely abstract. You can understand abstract things, but you can only know things that are let's say inexperience and let's say tangible and potentially reproducible. Then you can, or at least somehow predictability, which is I don't actually think knowledge, I don't think is capable of conserving itself, because you need to have an understanding of knowledge and how sort of empiricism does this, which I think is actually doesn't even work, but essentially it conflates predictability with reality. And so already within the realm of trying to sort of ground knowledge in itself, you have to create an abstraction or a hypothetical sort of, this is why scientism is fundamentally a bankrupt philosophical worldview. It doesn't hold any water. It's a weird kind of wishful thinking, because essentially knowledge claims still run aground when it comes to epistemology. And they kind of get around that because predictability is essentially a kind of, is just a kind of table thumping, well, there's no alternative. They kind of get away with their sort of self-referencing sympathy, intellectual sympathy that they bestow upon themselves. Well, if anyone deserves to have a kind of bootstrapped epistemology, it's us who just claim that all we care about is knowledge and we don't care for understanding. So, I would say it exhausts itself, and in some sense science has even fundamentally done that. Science as a project, if you actually look at the fruits of science, it is fundamentally self-negating, because science has told us that the world is not deterministic, it's probabilistic. And so they've kind of even displaced predictability now with statistical confidence, which is, a kind of hucksterism. So science itself is now grounded somehow in statistics, in somehow, and so you get this weird sophomoric, kind of sentiment that science is grounded in pure mathematics. And so, I say that therefore knowledge ends up relying on a kind of understanding abstraction anyway. It just tries to do so with a kind of external locus of control. That statistics and math is really a kind of theistic force and God. That because we call it math and science, we can say that we're capable of growing in some kind of materialistic knowledge of it and formalized interpretation of it, and so I mean it's a cult in itself, I would say. It's anyway. So I mean that's just an example of but okay, let me just keep it simple. So basically there are two things that we have to, let's say, care about. There's knowledge and understanding. Now in what I go on to describe, I'm basically trying to say that values and principles have to sort of fundamentally stay immaterial. They have to fundamentally, you can't live without understanding, essentially. So the thing is that, yes, the understanding is, let's say, you see, because understanding and knowledge are not the same thing, because understanding is almost fundamentally an abstraction. It's an immaterial, spiritual even. I mean, I think that this is actually where spirit comes from, we understand, the thing that we understand is how things should be. it's an introverted feeling in a Jungian cognitive function sense. Um, Whereas knowledge is an argument that can't ground itself. It's a never-ending argument. You can always argue about knowledge, and it has no resolution. And without understanding and knowledge sort of working together with the understanding taking the lead, I don't think you get anywhere. So it's weird that essentially knowledge, in some basic sense, is the natural substrate, and understanding is incorporated within knowledge, but is in some sense superior to it. So, in a weird sort of ontological sense, knowledge is prior to understanding, but understanding must be superior to knowledge. So it's almost as if understanding is incorporated, encapsulated within the flesh. The spirit is within the flesh of the world. In the world, but not of it. Okay, so that is how I see all of this philosophically resolved, and you can use the religious imagery, I think, quite effectively to help understand this, because this is an understanding that is what it is, and without an understanding, we are lost, and we are insolubly lost as well. So anyway, so people who just try to have a knowledge-based worldview are, fundamentally sort of nihilists or become cultists around some arbitrary feature of materialism or something like that. That they've created a totem, they've created an idolatry, essentially, which is going to give them a test, and then that test is going to be the supplementation of spiritual authority, essentially, because they don't see the authority in understanding. They don't respect. It's okay. Those are have to start defining these terms and go deeper and deeper. And this is very complicated, but I mean that's kind of the. So yes, understanding itself isn't a simple thing. It requires then further and further sophisticated, sort of paradigms and schemas of how other issues interrelate with one another. It's not as if in some sense, I think that the whole knowledge-based worldview is a simplistic cop-out. It's like, well, everything is way too complicated, and this is the only way that we can even have something nice, because the alternative is just a kind of simultaneous equation that never balances, and it's too much patience and work to go into trying to derive and balance that simultaneous equation. Okay, so anyway, and let's say the humility to search for let's say that form of understanding, which in some sense, even then, if you have the humility, you never lose the humility, and the humility is in some sense part of the active life of pursuing that understanding, because it's a pursuit that never ends in some sense. First seek the kingdom, and it's sort of, and everything will be added. The search never ends. The quickening spirit, as it's called as well. And so it's the understanding is the understanding of a practice. It doesn't derive into materialistic formulation. It doesn't derive prescriptions in that kind of but there is a kind of spiritual knowledge, and a lot of that is a little bit weird and dangerous, because it's sort of tempered by important concepts like forbidden knowledge, knowledge of the soul, knowledge of the Holy Ghost, in terms of deriving it as an image, because as soon as you think you know what the Holy Ghost looks like, then I would say that that's a formulation of eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then you become a slave to a kind of a moral dichotomy, which you have to know about, and you have to sort of, and that tree of knowledge has to grow within you, which in some sense takes over the project of living, which is intellectually my summary of the false ego complex. But I don't want to get too much into psychology. And this is something that has to be reckoned with and worked through, in the revelation of God, in the anyway, these are things that I'm working on in my psychological work, and I don't want to. Yeah, I do think that the personality construct itself is embedded in, let's say, these issues, and if you philosophically already concede on these issues, then you're not capable of doing work towards self-integration and self-actualization and self-realization, whatever you want to call it. Transcending the mechanics of one's own fallen personality schema, which I think can be quite radically transfigured. Anyway, yeah. So I have exhausted the point that I was going to make. Yeah. So I just wanted to bring up the sort of the knowledge and understanding thing, which is, something that it seems Stephen Fry has given some proper thought and consideration to. The difference between, but I think he has come up with the wrong answer. And I'm very sensitive to the point that people have bad understandings, and they have been led by their bad understandings, and they have created bad fruit even, and bad outcomes. And in experience, we can judge them as a failure or something like that. That kind. I mean, I don't think that that's an easy claim to make, because I do think that everything has to be discerned. You have to kind of dissect that. You have to actually look into that, because it's not as easy as just, well, it had a bad outcome, therefore it had wrong thinking that went into it. It's not as easy as that. You have to sort of work out the workings of the understandings and what they were up against, and sort of that does sort of incept you into, let's say, an abstraction or something like that. And those are mysteries that need to be plumbed. They need to be the depths of which need to be dissected and discerned. And in some sense, if you think that it's all just interpretation at the end of the day, then there's no value in doing that, and there's no sort of integrative procession towards attaining towards a single understanding and a single faith. Or if you don't even think that those words hold any currency, then essentially you're just trying to find positive outcomes anyway, in which case you're just kind of enslaving yourself to some kind of material, and it doesn't outcome, and it doesn't matter the process or the procedure that leads towards it. So yeah, I mean, at some point it's weird, because I don't think that you can kind of mediate between knowledge and understanding. You have to say, at the end of the day, if you don't have your feet grounded in firmly on top of a solid understanding, then essentially you end up compromising, and you end up sort of whittling away at you end up with essentially no values. It's sort of I mean, this is quite an embarrassing thing, because I haven't exactly drawn these lines, but it's in the same tone as the Benjamin Franklin quote that those who would trade freedom or liberty for security deserve neither, and will land up having neither. Sorry, there's a horrible butchering of the quote, but it's that kind of it's exactly that kind of property about the understanding, which is like liberty. You can't trade it for an alternative value. It's just it's in a different caliber. It's in a different sort of primordial, original sort of substrate. Um, and if you don't kind of privilege that epistemological substrate, then you lose the criteria with which you can even have a lens on reality, through which you can see and make contact with reality. Um, anyway, so I'm kind of repeating myself. There was another point around this, is that I mean, this is perhaps very. This is a tough subject, because this is almost like sort of teaching basic morality or something like that, and it is obviously very hard to start off a kernel of a moral worldview or something like that, which is something like a seed that has to sort of start to grow, and it doesn't become a tree overnight, and it, in some sense. Uh, Biological things are very sort of complicated networks and webs of things that have to sort of be aligned and things like that. And it's a lot of things have to come into kind of organic conformity, especially in sort of the early phases or something like that. Just how dynamic and fluid it kind of has to be. And in some sense, being okay with certain mysteries, and let's say having bundles of values and principles, and trying to work out a hierarchy, and sort of I mean, that's what understanding is that you have component parts, and you know how those component parts interrelate with one another. um, or when I say no, I mean, in this context, it's more like a belief claim, because you don't know how they interrelate. You believe that that is how they should interrelate with one another, and then that is your understanding of that subject matter, or those things at work, with and interrelated with each other, which is a field or subject within your understanding, therefore. Um, and understanding is a very personal, cultivated thing. Um, and knowing that you don't understand something, or knowing, because in some sense it's almost like a technology. It's sort of like, if you wield your understanding as a articulation, as an actualization of your own ability to interrelate elements of subject matter, um, then you're very aware of your own sort of ability to permeate different understandings, and the different choices between different models of let's say value hierarchies and maximizing positive values in particular trade-offs, because in terms of applying and understanding in the real world, because the understanding will always be a kind of ideal abstraction, and the real world, um, yeah, in this sense, I think that it's clear that the understanding is fundamentally um, reducible to an awareness of where you are going to move into a field of operation which you don't understand, that you are aware of your boundary of understanding, which kind of gives you the territorial edifice that you have, that you can work with confidence, in terms of being empowered, in terms of uh, understanding what it is that you're doing within a particular context or something like that. Um, and that is, I think, let's say the prima materia upon which civilization and society and culture operates at potentially a high level of integrity and fidelity, is only capable when we understand what we're doing, um, and that we share an understanding of what it is that we're doing with the people that we are correlating with or coordinating with. Anyway, I'm getting into and this is how there if there's a substitute to that, I don't think it's I mean, in certain contexts there might be a feasible substitute to that, but you can't avoid that fundamental substrate, and the imperative to share a common understanding, because otherwise I think things will fundamentally be prone to, let's say, the infernal nature of contestation over knowledge claims and arguments over knowledge, um, which are the source of all controversy and fractious, fractious and unstable or chaotic relations. Anyway, sorry, I'm kind of pontificating about strange civilizational themes, but yeah, and I would perhaps talk about politics and libertarianism being the kind of the general kind of template within which the imperative of sharing common understandings is placed at a kind of cultural nexus to sort of to being the bridge or the pathway towards orientating people towards seeing the imperative or the necessity of generating common understandings in order to effectuate their rather than trying to rely on kind of state mandates and coercion, the use of coercive force in order to sort of supplement for the generation of a common understanding. So I mean, it's interesting how this fundamental truth, I would say, is represented in the basic manifestation of all sort of human conflict. Is in some sense the lack of operating within a field of a common understanding. I might have to sort of steel man that my own concept, because that might not be enough to say that, well, some understandings are obviously just sort of obvious shells of non-understanding. They're just sort of formalized kind of knowledge claims. Like and then a lot of that is also prone to certain kinds of spirits of purpose and interpretation and spin, which is because you can, what is an understanding for one person, another person reading that understanding doesn't see an understanding, they see a knowledge claim, and then it's obviously not a shared understanding, even though the person will say, oh well, I know what it is that you think. And it just shows you the kind of that, I guess, is what I would just describe as another manifestation of the kind of the reactive mentality of the kind of the parasitic nature of trying to ground one's worldview in knowledge claims. It means that you have to find some source of an understanding or a higher value that you kind of have to bastardize or parasitize or sort of redirect, and in the derogation of the other's sort of positive purpose, you can kind of give yourself a kind of reactive impetus. It's almost like trying to ground things in knowledge, I think, is a kind of is almost like a cult of entropy in some sense. It's sort of like a it has that kind of fatalism built into it. This kind of this sort of external locus of a sense of its own origination is sort of outsourced and is only found externally, and so it sort of becomes a weird kind of parasitic or steward or abrogator of some kind of it just it runs aground. It becomes chaff. So which is why it's never nice to sort of actually deal with people who are operating from such a worldview. They always have this strange kind of I want to say sort of reticence, but it's deeper than that. It's sort of like that they live in a pool of quicksand, and sort of sharing the space with them and sharing their groundwork, sort of draws you into captivity with them, where their sort of their understanding is sunken in place. Because it looks like sort of sand, but it's actually I can't think of the poetry, but sort of some kind of cement tomb, I guess. But you sort of, the consolation is that the cement isn't dry, so it's sort of like water and earth colluding to supply the appearance of grounding, but the the treachery of water that has lost all of its transparency. Anyway, okay, so yeah, I think I'm going to change the label of this recording to include a discussion of variants of stupidity, which you know, it is slightly, you know, this is perhaps all of these sophisticated philosophical, you know, issues of epistemology that I'm bringing into this issue, you know, is quite sad, because this is a big pill to swallow if you're going to start having an interlocutor, if you're going to start calling an interlocutor stupid. But I do think that, I think my general thesis is correct, that at least when we had a culture where it was okay to call people stupid and use the slur retarded, that it held the door open to these kinds of issues of authenticity, of carefulness, of seriousness, of good faith, in terms of grounding one's intellectual positions. It broadened the horizon of intellectual discourse into, I don't, you know, for me, using the phrase ad hominem is such a, it triggers me really, because I think that character is a huge part of someone's intellectual position. That, well, I mean that's perhaps because I am in this little kooky camp where epistemological pragmatism, and my particular flavor of which is epistemic agency, means that essentially how people ground their epistemology and their actual character are inextricably bound together. But I mean, this is something that I think also can be educated. You know, it is there's a brilliant essay, Epistemic Agency, by Catherine Elgin. I hope I'm pronouncing her surname correctly. I know they called them the Elgin Marbles, I think, but pronunciation has always been a bane of mine. Anyway, yeah, I think I've pontificated enough about this, but yeah, I just wanted to add the knowledge, understanding layer to this matter.